Welcome to another episode of the Information Addicts podcast. My name is Cassidy. I'm an information addict, and this is my podcast where I explore information, ideas, and beliefs and try to do those things more responsibly. Today, I have a conversation for you with my friend Bill. I always enjoy having conversations with Bill on the Discord. He is a lovely conversationalist, and I really enjoyed the way that he looks at science and philosophy and the way those things help us to understand reality and the way our world actually works. And so I asked him to come on and talk about those things. We had some technical difficulties, but I was able to salvage enough of it to really get a good bulk of the conversation. So I have it here to share for you. So apologies for all of the little the technicalities, but hopefully you find it still enjoyable outside of all of that. So here we are. Let's go.
Bill, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you, Cassidy.
Of course. So today we're going to talk a little bit about science and the way that people use that and like justify that and kind of talk about it in ways that they don't quite understand. But before we do that, why don't you just give a brief introduction about yourself, what kind of gets you interested in science, just a little bit of your background.
My academic background is in quantum mechanics, specifically condensed matter physics, which is the very, very small and the very, very cold. That's what it's kind of dealing with. But currently now I am working as a physicist with regards to software engineer, which is developing real-time software for smoke simulations and fire simulations. So things for in games and films and all that lot. Great for artists. So that's what I'm doing at the moment. Anyway, yes. So general reason why I got into science is always as a kid, always fascinated by just how the world works in general and like asking that why question. So I'm a kid that just never stopped asking why is probably it. Why? I've just always been interested, not just in science, but just everything I get my hand on pretty much.
Yeah.
Every topic.
So quantum mechanics, quantum physics, I feel like that's the kind of science that's the most confusing for people and the most misunderstood. So what first of all, what drew you to that? And then we can kind of move into sort of some of the misconceptions that you often see when talking about those issues.
Yeah, sure. So the main thing that drew me in is that it is completely unintuitive. Like this is clearly it's a good, very, very good description of reality, but it completely goes against your own intuition because most people from since they're young, very used to things happening. Like, okay, here's a thing. It's in my hand right now, or it's right here. It exists right here, and I move it, and we can figure out what happens when we throw it. Whatever, just random object, and that's fine. But now, when you get to the quantum world, things are more probabilistic in a sense. They've kind of got an uncertainty attached to everything, which is fine. But then it's more of things start behaving in different ways than you would expect them compared to what you live on this world in like our level. So learning about all those different behaviors and stuff, like how things, different things, interactions, it's all very weird. That's kind of what drew me in, at least with that. And specifically the field I was kind of driven into is just in that area, things even become just as weirder, even though many people love the high energy stuff, which is like the LHC and CERN does with high particle stuff.
Mm-hmm.
The cold stuff, the very, very slow stuff, is just as weird. Things start, the best way of explaining it is that particles kind of start to lose their identity and they all start to have, they all go into their ground state and they all kind of start behaving as in a big collective mass. So they lose their identity effectively. I'm trying to be very general here in an explanation. But yeah, and then other things, properties like many different immersion things can't popping out of this kind of, it's called a condensate of this anyway, yeah.
So is there any good explanations yet of why it acts so weird? Or is it still people still trying to figure out and come up with theories to make sense of a lot of it?
Well, we know that, this may sound daft, is that, which way should we start with? First off, the history of quantum mechanics is bizarre. First off, it started off as a history of trying to discover how an oven worked. Not even a joke, a regular oven. Because with the physics at the time, they were expecting, like the maths kind of said, we're expecting loads of ultraviolet coming out of here. It's called the ultraviolet problem. And it were not. And it wasn't until Max Planck, but first of all, also Boltzmann and also Max Planck realized, actually, no, the energy is coming out here has to be quantized, which is where the word quantum from. It's like it's quanta, just quantum means like a single unit in a sense, and it's coming out in that sort of way. And these packets of energy, these photons, like light pocket packets, are in these little quantas. They're individual things. It's not a continuous wave, or anything like that. That's the first thing. Next person to do was Einstein, actually, was all the big thing. He did the photoelectric effect, which is, you can figure out that, what's the best way of putting it? I'm trying to think of photoelectric effect is light can come down, energize like an electron, and produce photoelectric, so it goes an electric current or something, or electric current produce light. You can got the transfer between the two of them, and because it will go into different energy states. That's kind of how it works. So that's what Einstein kind of, one of the next things, and it only does that with discrete levels as well in the atoms. So only just certain types of photons of certain energies will actually interact with it and cause those states, the absorption and emission. And then the next person is Schrodinger, which I'm going through the history. Schrodinger came up with the Schrodinger equation, and the story of that is the most bizarrest, because no one knows actually how he came up with it. All that we know is he went into a log cabin one day with his wife and some other woman, because he was, let's just say he, and after a little while, it came out with this and this equation, and it seems to describe reality. Yeah, so yes, many women in a log cabin seem to work for him somehow. Yes, and I'm really toning down the story of that as well. It's
wild.
Yeah, and that's kind of the history. And all these weirdness came popping out, and you just from experimental evidence, you can see that it predicts reality extremely well. So why is the universe like this way? Who knows? It just is. But the question is, it does seem to be this case, and then you keep extending it further and more. And then the history is going, okay, everything is not just these wave functions. We can also describe things in fields as well, and you get to quantum field theory, and it's a big zoo. Yeah. So Schrodinger's cat is, okay, I didn't talk about Schrodinger's cat is this idea that until you measure something, the idea is that things can be in a superposition of different states. So in normal classical world, as we call it, rather than quantum, we think things have a very discrete state to them. Yeah, does that make sense? So in the quantum world, things more act like kind of like waves in a sense. So a wave, like on a sea, is actually made up of multiple different waves. You can actually generate any wave from adding multiple waves together. So a very simple one is like, for instance, you have a normal wave, add another wave on top, you have a different sound. So you actually hear different things, like, for instance, a sine wave. A sine wave is the most simplest wave you can think of. So it's like something like square wave is made up of loads of different things you can add up on top, and it's a harsh kind of sound. But these all can be made as a kind of superposition of different wave states. Now, it turns out that because everything seems to have this kind of wave-like nature, everything also has this superposition-like nature to it as well. So a particle, like anything else, like an electron or something, has wave-like properties, and it also has its states are in like a kind of in different superpositions. So it can be in the superposition of, let's say, its ground state and its first excited state. And truly in a proper superposition. So it means it will be in a state of both have the lower state and the upper state at the same time. In certain interpretations of quantum mechanics, that means until we measure it, it will be in the superposition. When we measure it, it will collapse. It will collapse the wave function, it's called, and collapse into one of those two states when you measure it. And there's kind of a probabilistic chance. So the superstate you have it's a 50%, is a 40% chance it will be in the ground state, 60% chance it will be in the first excited state. And when you measure it, you go, okay, there's a 6% chance it's going to be this. And then when you do measure it, okay, it's in the ground state. Okay, fine. So you kind of collapse the wave function, as they would state, in certain interpretations, of course. Not everyone agrees with this. Some physicists will go, no, there is no collapse, or there is what it's. Short answer is they all make the same predictions, so no one knows which one's correct. So you just kind of some people just say, shut up and just do the calculations, which is the most common view, by the way, actually. nowadays, I think. Yeah, there's some people who say the many worlds interpretation, but again, the interpretations to me, I'm like, they all make the same predictions. I don't really care. Some people are like, no, it's really this one or the other. But yeah, that's kind of the thing. So applying this to Schrodinger's cat, it's like the idea. The original one is there's a you got you got a radioactive isotope, and it has a chance of decaying in the next minute. There's a 50-50 chance of decaying in the next minute. And the one that Schrodinger came up with, if it does decay in the minute, then it will hit this vial and release poison into the box, killing this cat that you don't know. Einstein's version was dynamite. He preferred dynamite, but clearly just killing the cat either way. So within this minute time frame, you could say there's a 50% chance that this radioactive isotope could decay and trigger this thing off. So before you measure it, you could state there is a superposition of the states between the cat being alive and the cat being dead. This is kind of a macro scale. So the idea is until you measure it, you do not know for certain which state it will be in, or not even just that, it technically is in both states at the same time. It's in a superposition of being dead and superposition of being alive. Now that's where the weirdness goes.
Yeah.
That's the weirdness, because it's like, wait, how does that work? But it's more like, in those cases, the cat's a bit higher, big level system. It's a bit more thing. But even in like a small system, maybe if it's just, if the radioactive thing decay and it just turns on a light inside the box, do you know the light's on or off? That's just, I'm just trying to think of even more simpler states like that. But it isn't until you start to measure it, this is the measurement thing, then it will start to, you'll see which outcome happened. So it's this measurement of how about reality is the weirdness. So it's the measurement, how things, when you measure things, that's where the weirdness comes from, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hopefully it makes sense.
I mean, it makes as much sense as it can, like without going into deeper detail, I think.
Yeah.
You know, and I think a lot of times it's like you think you understand, but you're not totally like comprehending exactly what's being meant by some of the stuff.
It goes against all your own intuition. Yeah. But it is not intuitive whatsoever. You just pretty much like, here's the maths, I'll write it down and just keep going on with it.
Don't ask.
Yeah, it's weird. Sometimes you do ask. That's where the good questions are. You may not like the answers, or maybe you'll be more like, okay, that what? Yeah, there's just there's weirdness, and they're the simple weirdness things. I say the simple ones. Then you got quantum entanglement to worry about, which is another weird thing.
Yeah.
Which is just it's really bizarre how the world works. It's not as simple as people used to think, because again, another story about history. It was always lovely learning the history of physics, because when you actually get taught physics, you actually get taught it in the order it was actually discovered. So you start with Galileo, then you go to Newton, then you probably go to someone like Faraday, to Maxwell, to Planck, to Einstein, and literally you go in the order it was discovered. So you do learn the history as you go along. And one of the things was at the end of the 19th century, pretty much loads of physicists came together and went, yep, we've figured it all out. We've just got a little bit of error here. We'll just get better measurements. We figured it all out pretty much, right? People like, what about the orbit of Mercury? We'll just get better. What about all this weird behavior? We'll figure it out. Turns out, one, the orbit of Mercury couldn't be explained by Newton. It needed general relativity, which is Einstein. And that means Newton was wrong, technically. Also, all the other stuff, we've got quantum mechanics popped out and produced all the other stuff. Yeah, there's loads of stuff. Clearly, they were wrong. There's loads more to discover. And it just keeps going on. Yeah.
Well, I think that's something that's just innate in us as humans. We want the certainty. Yeah. We want to say we have all the answers. And I think even in scientific communities where, we always question everything and, we can't say we officially have the answers, there's somewhat of a behavior of, saying we figured it all out, we can explain it all.
And I think some of the best scientists in general are the ones that are the most doubtful. They are not very certain about their views and not necessarily open, that's not the right word, but again, just not certain about these things. Like, okay, if you are certain, you're wrong. It's pretty much the best way of putting it.
Yeah. Okay, so you've got all of this background, this history, and these like loaded ideas of what all of this means, yet all of this science gets thrown into pop culture and used in arguments to like for or against things. And where are some of the issues you see with that, where it's adopted by popular thought?
So there's a few different ways of looking at it. So science itself is kind of purely descriptive in that sense, as in, let's just start with the basic scientific, just keep it the scientific method, the general one, very, very general overview. You see something in the world, you can start, okay, I'll get a hypothesis of how this works. So you start with the hypothesis and you think, okay, can I test this hypothesis? Is it falsifiable? Is another way of putting it. If it's not falsifiable, it's called pseudoscience. So if it's falsifiable, okay, then I go try and see if I can do this test it in the world, try and prove this hypothesis is wrong, by the way. That's what you do in science. You're trying to prove it's wrong. You can never prove it's correct. And you just try and give more and more evidence. And if you've got loads of evidence to suggest that it's actually probably correct, that's when you call it a theory. So before that's always a hypothesis. But the thing about science is you're always trying to prove yourself as wrong as quickly as possible, because you don't want to waste time. And also it's like you want to see if those hypotheses are wrong. So notice these things is they are just purely descriptive. You're just trying to describe reality. And when you're just coming to, like, for instance, people talk about science in general, like in the pop culture, there's usually different ways of saying, oh, look how cool it is, and all the science and all this stuff, like on like TV shows, getting people interested, and they're wonderful shows. Again, so that's kind of some of the reasons I got into it as a kid. But so I'll never say they're bad. But then there's also the pop culture of like saying, some people say, oh, well, science tells us X, Y, and Z, and then just talk nonsense. So they'll do I won't even go there for the time being yet. Some people say that science tells us we ought to do X, Y, and Z. And that's where I'm like, okay, no, it doesn't. Because science is, again, descriptive. It's not prescriptive. So prescriptive is, again, morality at the end of the day. So you've got science and morality. Science is the is, trying to describe how the is. Morality is about the oughts, what you ought to do. And in many senses, science, all it can tell you is, in order for, say, I want to achieve this certain goal, then science may say it may be reasonable that you should do, if you want to achieve these things may be the best way of achieving it, or these different approaches with different sort of ideas. And that's all that science can do, pretty much, with regards if you can apply it to moral questions or politics or philosophy or whatever, even just day-to-day life. And I think that's where a lot of people make the mistake. And this is actually, this is related to the is-or gap, which is David Hume, if people know their philosophy. And the technical term for this, I would call it, in my opinion, this is my personal view, philosophy, this is not, everyone believes this, of course, is that you cannot bridge this is-or gap. You cannot go from science to morality, even though many people have tried and try their best. And also not just trying to bridge this gap is the problem, but they are actually describing completely different things in the first place. So they're talking about different things in the first place. And it just goes down the whole philosophical rabbit hole, but that's the thing. But this is where, if you'll see people talk about all this, at the moment, sometimes people use the science, especially currently in our time, as more of a, in a sense, of kind of religious sense. Like there's, and I do not mean this is an insult to people. There's some people in their science interest, they're like, oh my God, science is so cool. We just listen to the scientists, they know what the best is and all like that. And I'm like, yeah, science is cool, but the scientists don't know what's best because the scientists, they know what's best about science. Yeah, they know that, yeah, but they may not know, and they may know what's good, they may be in their professions about how to do different experiments, but they won't know much about anything else. Most people don't know outside their own field. Because it's really difficult to know more than outside your own field. But the second thing is, more people say, well, we should listen to the science. Again, using the stuff nowadays. And the problem is, well, you can read the science, but then you've got to use your own moral systems to actually enact and use them to enable to figure out what to do next. And the science will not tell you anything. The science will tell you, well, today X, Y, and Z happened, and and this thing happened with this thing if you did this thing, blah, 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 whatever. And these were the results of the experiment. Okay, that was what the scientific thing, or this is the meta study that we did, or whatever in general. But then you've got to think, okay, these are my principles I'm applying. Okay, what am I trying to achieve? What is the other things? Okay, can this thing be achievable through the certain goals and means and things like that? And in those cases, these start becoming kind of economics questions. And then they also start not just moral questions and economics questions, and they start becoming less scientific. So that's one thing that gets annoys me. Just people say, okay, listen to the science. And I'm like, yeah, we listen to the science. It doesn't tell me what to do.
Right.
And then the last thing I was kind of wanting, you were bringing up earlier, was the people who use science to explain the magical or stuff like that, or the woo, as I can sometimes say. And these more like the Deepak Chakras of the world. And a lot of them are just like, okay, this is science. It's like quantum mechanics. It's magic. It's understandable, mystical thing. Therefore, I can use it to use whatever I want it to mean. I'm like, but most people are like, yeah, whatever, just shut up. But yeah, there you go. People be people, I guess.
People be people, yeah. No, it's interesting because you're right in the sense of it is just this description, right? Science is this testing to get a description of what's happening in the world.
Yes.
But with science alone doesn't get us to understand anything under that. Just asking, what does that mean? What does the science mean? Now we're moving into the realm of philosophy, and I think sometimes there is this lack of respect for the switch. And the understanding that when we're talking about science, we're not just talking in one field, we're talking in multiple, whether it's just philosophy, science, and then there's a whole other aspect of like your experiences and what you bring to the table and all of the things that you've learned moving towards that give you a perspective on the way that you look at these things. It's very, very interesting dynamic.
Yeah, and again, if you know the history, science used to be called natural philosophy. It was philosophy of the natural world, and that's kind of how, again, go back to Newton, that's what he would have been called, a natural philosophy, a natural philosopher, or in that regard, or a mathematician, or any other things he was called. In fact, actually, he did a lot of stuff. Newton did. But like literally, I mean a lot. He also run like the Mint and the Bank of England, stuff like that. He did. Oh God, he was a polymath. He also tried to do alchemy as well, and he did. Yeah, the stuff he was wanted to be remembered for was his work on the Bible, effectively. I want to find all the stuff in that, effectively. Yeah. So the thing he wanted to be remembered for, no one remembers it for him anymore. Just remember him for the mathematics and the physics, obviously. But yeah, and I think a lot that going to some of the great scientists of the world in general in history, not of them know hell of a lot about philosophy and history and stuff like that. And they're usually the more careful to say things because they know they don't know much.
Yeah, that's probably a good place to be, to just like recognize how little we actually do know. It keeps you,
and that's beautiful. I love it.
Keeps you from putting your foot in your mouth. That's for sure.
Oh yeah.
All right, but I want to kind of switch.
If we knew it all, life would be boring.
Yeah, exactly. So I kind of want to like pivot a little bit and talk a little more personally with you and just the connection with science and philosophy. And I even kind of want to talk about a little bit in New Atheism, because there's a lot of, the use of science to, make valid the points of that movement. And you grew up as an atheist, don't consider yourself an atheist anymore.
Yep.
Where is that switch, and how did science help you like process through those things?
For me, it was kind of, it did, and as well, it was more of that, I kind of took the Azort gap seriously. So for me, with very careful, atheism is an extremely broad camp, of course, but like it is just like, it's as broad as like saying a non-theist or a theist or any other particular metaphysical belief. But the views that I was kind of asking, I'm going to question clearly, just asking, okay, so what do I actually believe? Why do I believe it the way I do? And what justifications do I have for this belief? And then I kept going down. I'm like, I'm kind of just assuming a bunch of things which I have no reason to assume. And it was effectively like a very poor form of materialism. And like New Atheism is a good example of this, where they are effectively materialists, literalists, and they have, I would honestly say most of them have a very naive view of religion. They think religion is a very I'm trying to think of I'm not trying to think of an insulting term here. I'm just trying to think of more of a, they view religion as this just random superstition. It's just random practices which don't really have anything to them. It's oppressive. They're just people enforce it on each other, yada yada, all that kind of nonsense, as they kind of state. And these practices are barbaric, and they're all things, and they've been horrible things, and to subjugate people over the centuries. And I kept asking, I kind of just went to question one day. I'm like, so why do we think they're barbaric? Like, why do we think they're bad? Like, where does these ideas that we are judging them from come from? Because these things didn't come out of nowhere. They clearly, there's a history behind them. They have evolved. They didn't just spring out of no idea. And when I kind of realized, I went, oh wait, all the New Atheists are just Protestants. They are literally Protestants who don't believe in God. And that's like their morality, their philosophy, all comes from here. The exceptions may be Christopher Hitchens, who was technically a communist, but even then, communism, Marxism technically does come from the Western tradition through like Hegel and stuff. And Hegel again was still kind of weird believer in God and stuff. But yeah, so it's all like, it still comes from the same root. It's not like it's coming from Buddhism or like Hinduism or anything of that tradition. So I was like, okay, so these ideas are coming from a particular source, and they're using that source to reject it. So I thought, okay, they kind of just contradict themselves. But I think, okay, no, fine. Let's just take their materialistic views seriously. Let's just take it seriously. And I kind of went into nihilism because of it. Because I went, I cannot justify any of my moral beliefs with this system. None of them. Because from this system, it just seems we're just made of atoms that are just following rules, and there's no beliefs, there's no morality. It's just things, just things happening. It's like, it's not you cannot live that way. If you honestly believe that. Daniel Dennett does, by the way. He's a full-on nihilist. And he's one of the New Atheists. The other New Atheists are nihilists, which is interesting to say the least. Like Sam Harris is more of a utilitarian in many regards. Not a very good one, but he is a utilitarian. You got someone like Richard Dawkins, he's a bit of an evangelist in general, but he only got into the scene because he was annoyed with people like using. They're going into his field of biology and genetics and stuff, and they were saying this is just wrong, so I'm just going to get into it. And then he went into more religious stuff. That's his kind of history.
Yeah.
And then it kind of got unraveled from there. But for me, it was more like, okay, that's not right. So I went, okay, if I'm not going to accept this, where can I deal from it? So that is all that went, okay, I'm going to take it seriously and see, okay, how can you recover from this? And luckily people have already figured it out before me. And it's like, yeah, no, it's all right. There's other ways around it. And the general solution was, if I believe morality is a real thing, like it exists, but I also know you can't bridge this gap, this or gap, which some people believe. They're called ethical naturalists, by the way. I came to the conclusion of called ethical non-naturalism, which is effectively a form of like a common sense method. So I mean, common sense in a very technical sense of that word, not just common sense. Everyone has that coming, but never like a sense, like we have a sense of the good, a sense of we have a way of, we can understand and interpret things, a way of thinking, an intuition of the world that's kind of built into us. Like
our sense of touch or smell. We have a sense of good.
Yeah, like we have a sense of hearing, sense of smell. In a sense, you could say it's like another sense or like an intuition in our brain, like a rational intuition. There's different ways of looking at it. My view is that people, sometimes we seem to have this sense of what is good. We have an intuition about it. And good, I mean in a very broad sense. Because ethical naturalism, which is one of the views I came to conclude, was more of a, I may be wrong, by the way, this may be completely wrong, it's just my views at the moment. It was more of, actually, there's also different forms of good which you can't compare. So it's technically an ethical pluralism. Oh God, it just goes confusing. It turns out reality is confusing, which is why I'm like, okay, I don't like any of this, but it seems to be correct. Let's go along with it. But that was one thing. So that was just the very, very mathematical, physical math thing. But the other thing was, like, for instance, when I was looking at the New Atheists, and I said they don't understand religion. one of them was just Richard Dawkins, and I'm thinking Richard Dawkins isn't even applying his own ideas to religion. Like he's not applying the idea. These clearly evolved. These ideas, these practices evolved over time, and they seem to have some utility to them. They seem to have had these practices help these communities survive. And some of these ideas, these memes, as he would use it in his mimetic ideas, seem to be very successful for making these groups of people, these moral groups, succeed better. As in, be more better survive. And these ideas survive as well. They act like genes of ideas. These are what memes mean. But he keeps thinking they're all bad. Everything's bad about religion. It's all just superstition, yada, yada, yada. I'm like, so he's ignoring his own ideas, and he can't apply them to this because he's got this, it's a very dogmatic view. The people he's criticizing are pretty much himself in that regard, with that particular view. Something it's very like, okay, these people are not even applying their own logic to themselves. And if you start doing that even to your own self, it can send you mad. But so I kept thinking, okay, very interesting stuff like that, and things. But this kind of concept didn't actually, for me, I'm trying to think. For me, I got interested. I just started kind of reading books, and I started reading books on like economics and philosophy, which is kind of where I started. And then a little later on, a lot of other things started happening at that time, on the internet in general. Like people, it's like one person would be like John Pearson, and John Pearson, as many people probably know who's listening, is this Canadian psychology professor. I thought, I like psychology. Why is he in the news? And he's talking about this thing. So, I like he's a very principled man. He's kind of defending what he believes in. Let's see what else he's got. And I'm like, started watching all of his psychology videos. I'm like, okay. And he started like, okay, he's got lectures about stuff. And I'm like, other things like lectures about the Bible. I'm like, okay, what the hell? And Jung, and like, what was all this? What's all this weirdness? You click and you watch it, and I'm like, oh, he's giving kind of an evolutionary account and psychological account of religion in a sense. And I'm like, oh, this is really interesting. So you kind of follow along, and you find more people who talk about this stuff, and you just keep going down this rabbit hole. And you just start thinking about, okay, let's just start from a scientific standpoint. But the thing with the scientific standpoint is he only gets you so far. Because as soon as you start thinking it from another standpoint, which is kind of how you experience the world, that doesn't really make sense. The scientific picture is, again, pure descriptive, but that's not how you experience the world. And for me, it was more like I couldn't square these two things. And I struggle, and I'm still struggling, by the way. I'm still struggling to square them, because it seems to be that the way that I experience the world and the way that the scientific world, they aren't the same nor equal. And again, it's very hard to explain your own ideas here. Sometimes just thinking out loud as I'm speaking, but I'm trying to figure out where it came from.
Yeah, no, it's totally fine. I mean, that all sort of makes sense to me. And my story, I kind of came from the opposite place, where I grew up Christian and very evangelical Protestant, and went through a similar, I guess, deconstruction to try to like square it and make sense of what I believe. And I think there's a lot of things that we actually now are agree with, even though I wouldn't necessarily say we believe all of the same things, but
no.
A lot of the philosophies and some of the things the places that we
got. The details aren't that important usually, but
but it's just interesting. I've always found it so interesting coming from the opposite side, and ending up in the same place and seeing, like, because you say things like, okay, I came to that conclusion too, but I feel crazy,
I know.
And I have to
I feel crazy too.
Well, I have to fight my own sort of like biases, right? Of like, this is what I grew up with, and this is what I knew. So there's always that question for me. It was hard to accept the conclusions in a certain aspect, because I was just like, am I just making the simpler choice, the easier choice to accept the things that I've always believed, or is this actually true? And so it's always interesting to kind of see people coming from the opposite side of like, okay, well, I didn't grow up in that, I didn't believe in God, and then
in fact, for me, religion is extremely foreign. Like, again, I mean that in a very literal sense. Like, brought as atheist means I have no thing, but even though when you go to school, you kind of the religious schools in the UK at least, and most schools are, like primary schools are at least. So at least you probably go to church every few months and stuff like that. And in school you have to do like hymns, you do hymns and prayers every day. Again, I never understood any of this. I used to sit down there in like assembly. I used to pray and be like thinking about what to have for lunch that day, because I never understood what you were meant to be doing. No one told you. And when they were doing listen to all this, it was like, okay, what stories? Okay, what does this mean? Okay, good, okay, whatever. And it's like kind of the idea, it just blows over you. And it's just like, it's not that, and even when you asked questions, either the teachers didn't give you a good answer, or they thought you were a child, that means you were an idiot. They thought you were an idiot, so they just gave you an idiot answer. And I'm like, I'm not an idiot, I just don't know anything, I'm a child. It's not the same thing. Or the people who were talking to it, they didn't know what they were talking about. Like seriously, they were just they themselves were probably just atheists. They were just going to a teacher doing this, and it's fine. You have to do, if you're in that school and you have to do what you have to do, fine. But it's like, so in that regard, it was no structure or anything like the history. And again, not even just trying to understand it. It didn't help. So for me, it was just like, goodbye. But I never actually, I was a new atheist. In fact, I never really went, this is all nonsense, all baloney. I went, I don't understand any of this. These people seem to do. Okay, there might be something to it, but I don't understand it. Mm-hmm. So like, again, I had friends who believe in stuff. Like, even when I was atheist, I had a friend who he was wanted to become a Wesleyan vicar, actually, he wanted to be. But like, I didn't understand any of it. Even when I asked him, it was like, because at the end, when you get there, people are talking completely different languages, and they literally think so differently that speaking to someone, they think, well, it's obvious what they're talking about. I'm like, I have no idea what he's talking about.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's the case. Like, sometimes you just cannot teach it. The person like myself, you have to kind of experience yourself. You have to go through it. You have to understand what it is. And yeah, it's bizarre.
Yeah, no, I definitely had that experience of, after sort of going away from Protestant churches all the time and being in communities with a lot of atheists, agnostics, and what have you, going back into church and understanding, oh, there's a language barrier here. You're saying these things, but like, I think you know what you mean, but I don't even think you totally understand what you mean. And like, yet we're all saying it, and we're speaking these languages. And it was really difficult to try and re-embrace church. And, you know, this thing that used to feel comfortable, that I thought I understood, coming to the other side and feeling that shift, it's wild. And I think that's probably the biggest disconnect with a lot of these conversations. It's like two people speaking two very different languages, trying to get the other person to understand without being willing to like accommodate for the other and try to like speak their language a little bit. It's wild.
Yeah. Another thing for me was, I always find it off-putting as well. Like, I don't mean it in a bad sense. I mean, like, if you went to like I literally only went to pretty much Protestant churches. Like, if I went into the weddings or funerals or other events in general, and I always found them, again, they were off-putting to me. A lot of them, and I mean this in a technical sense, I don't mean this in a bad sense, they felt feminine to me. And what I mean by that is not that even if they had a male vicar, I don't just mean that, not because there were a lot of female vicars as well, but I mean, like, it felt more like a devouring mother who was giving the sermon rather than a kind of a strict father in that sense. It was more of a, we're all love, you can do all your sons, we just hang together and sing Kumbaya, that kind of thing. But it's more like, and it kind of all things together. And it's like, for a bloke at least, you don't want that message. You kind of want the exact opposite. You kind of want to say, no, you're not as good as the way you are. You're a pit-up, and you can do better. You kind of want that message. And for a bloke, you do, at least. I don't know many other people, but it was more like the messaging felt weak. It felt empty. It felt ugly. It's a good way of putting it. The hymns that many of them sung are very modern things, and they're very really crap music, to be honest with you, at the end of the day. Stuff like from the 1970s, and it's just absolutely dreadful. It's not like the old-fashioned stuff, which I like, oh, they're lovely hymns, they're beautiful stuff. You don't hear them anymore. And for me, that was all kind of off-putting. So weirdly enough, I live near a monastery. That's a Cistercian Trappist monastery, at least, and I just thought, you know what, I've never actually been to a Catholic sermon, especially not even a monastery, because I know they're even different. So let's just step in one day and see what, like, completely different feeling and completely different atmosphere, aesthetic in general. And it was kind of, I thought, well, this is beautiful. And I'm like, what the, that's someone was an atheist still at the time, like thinking, wait, what? And it's like, it was a very, everything had a very strict meaning for it. It was a very, you could clearly see there was an order to things, like the progression of how it did it, the way they said the stuff, this type of stuff they were doing. And it wasn't just like whatever the vicar thought that week was a good idea to talk about. It was more like, no, they had a reason why they were doing it. It's all, then it was all very ceremonial, very, again, I'm going to say masculine. And it's not because there's like 24 monks there or anything like that. It's just because it was, I'm kind of learning these terms, these old-fashioned terms for like what they mean, like metaphysical terms for masculine and feminine. And that's the best words I can use nowadays. Now I've got the language. It still doesn't mean it's the best way of describing it. It's just that's the only words I've got.
Yeah, well, you're not the only one who I've heard talk about that way, especially with the Protestant evangelical strain. Like, I've heard a lot of people have the criticism of it being hyper feminine. And I don't even think I totally understand what that means. And I, like, as a female myself, I don't necessarily.
I don't mean that as in woman. Like, I do not mean it in that sense.
No, I know, I know that. I think I have a hard time truly understanding exactly what people are getting out with that word, though. Because I mean, like,
for me, before I use that word, I used to say the word lovey-dovey, and I didn't mean that in a bad sense. I mean that in a very abstract sense of the word. Like, it is more of a, oh, just come together, hold hands, or just like sing and be happy and all that stuff. And it's more like it's trying to be, take the ignore the problems or try and be happy. Just come here and just praise the Lord or whatever that thing is. And if you're in Baptist, it's more just clapping the hands and be more singing and cheering in that regard, even more. But like, again, some of the Baptist funerals I've been to, the most cheeriest things I've ever been to. And I'm like, this is meant to be a funeral, right? But it's, I think it means kind of that. I mean, it's more of a, we'll just kind of love you regardless, which is fine, but just ignore your problems. And I'm like, no. And it's kind of that bit where if you kind of think of it as in like a mother figure and a father figure, mother is there just to love you. I don't mean that so general. I know that's not the case. Clearly not even my own mother's like that in that sense, but in a stereotype, I'm doing a very big stereotype. And against the and father was more like very strict. I know you have to pull yourself up, get on with it, and you're like, no, it's all come here, it's all right, it's all going to be okay. And like that. I don't mean it in that sense clearly, because my parents were not like that. Not my family's been like that in general, but that's the best way I can describe it. And it's a feeling that I can't put into words. That's the hard problem.
Yeah.
And describing it to someone else who doesn't understand, like, oh, of course I know what you mean. Like it's hard to say.
I think I can apprehend what you mean, you know, in the larger sense, but I myself can't necessarily pit it into words. But no, you're not the only person who has had that observation. And there is something about, you know, men being more drawn to something like orthodoxy, and I'm assuming Catholicism as well, versus women who are probably more drawn to Protestantism.
Yeah, I have no idea in that regard, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
It probably is. I have no idea. But it was more of, I'm not kind of drawn to any particular creed yet or anything like that, or even Christianity in general. But it's just more of a, for me, I'm just looking like, clearly there's different options out there. And if you do want to structure yourself, then you're going to probably just go for a particular tradition. But the weirdest thing is, if like, okay, traditions out there, okay, you could have Hinduism, you could go Sikhism, you could go Islam, Christianity, Judaism. But the thing is, a lot of them are just so foreign to me, like just extremely foreign, it wouldn't be helpful. Like for me, like I say Sikhism, even though I know Sikhs, the actual like idea of it is the religion is so foreign to me, the culture, the ideas, the practice in general, it would be just kind of like, okay, this is just a culture shock to me. It'd be like me going and now living in the middle of Japan. I don't know any Japanese, don't know any of the cultures, don't know any of the things. It's like, great, you could probably survive, but do you want to do that? like
I guess it depends.
I don't know. I guess it depends. And this question is, which one's clearly the correct one? If there is a correct one, or was one the most correct, or most true, or most useful, or whatever we want to phrase it in our friends
Right.
phrase. Which brings me on to one person in particular, which is C.S. Lewis.
Mm.
And I'm going to blame Paul van der Klee for him. I got me addicted on reading his books, not just Narnia in general, but not his brilliant books, but just in general, his more philosophical ones. And I know for him, when he was, because when his younger years, he was a properly strict, like you'd call a new atheist. He knew every single argument new atheist would and could argue against it.
Mm-hmm.
And then eventually, with the help of his friends, I think like Tolkien and stuff like that, kind of waned away against it. And he became a theist, I know that. But him at the time, he was seriously considering, and I think I have one of his books, I think it's in his Christian Reflections book. He wasn't sure which one to go to, like, is it Christianity or Hinduism? And he was serious, like, I don't know. And he actually said there's some really good arguments here for this, of like Hinduism or arguments for Christianity. And he was literally saying, okay, which is the better philosophy, pretty much? Not just better, which is truer?
Yeah. Because
he was like, okay, I really need to settle it down. I'm like, I'm probably in that stage for me. I'm like, where is the better philosophies in the world? And like, which one is the better one to choose? But it's... Yeah. And you always have that hesitation to choose, because once you choose it, you're going to have to agree with most of the doctrines and stuff like that. And it's like, I have no idea yet.
Well, yeah, it is so complicated. And I think for me, I'm a huge philosophy nerd. I think for me, that was the first thing I was drawn to when it came to like the unpacking of sort of religion. I mean, in some ways, I'd argue it's the best place to start, because before we can even talk about which God, we have to decide if we can even philosophically stand on the idea that there is one. Yeah. And so I love C.S. Lewis in that regard, where he really embraces that philosophy and uses that to come to a place of understanding of faith in Christianity. But it's not, that's the thing, it's not just sort of one thing. We can talk about which is the better philosophy or the more true philosophy, but outside of personal experience, how are we ever to know what's actually more true than another? And outside of the historical context, like that's important too. And then there becomes the theological contradictions and the way that it works within the system and how it's been changed throughout the church. It's so multifaceted and complicated that I don't think that the choice to claim something should be taken lightly. I think often we can talk ourselves into suspending our judgment in a place where, you know, it's probably unhealthy, where we already know what we believe and where we're going towards, but like we just don't want to admit it because we don't want to be proven wrong or whatever emotional reason. But
there's also a bit of pride as well. Yeah. And that, like, it's also, you don't want to be, it's kind of being disrespectful for your past self as one aspect. There's also pride in it, like you don't want to admit it to your friends and family, because it's like they're going to think you're weird or something like that, or how did you get conned into that nonsense or whatever it is like that. And it's like some answers to some people, like most favorite answers were just like, okay, whatever, carry on, they don't really actually care, which is good. Usually they're good friends, obviously, but some people like, I don't understand it, like, and that's fine. It's like they don't understand, it's like, okay, yeah, whatever. But yeah, it's a weird journey we're all on. It's the best way of putting it.
I think you hit the nail on the head in that, you know, there's a pride aspect and there's an emotional aspect. We're not just talking about simple data here and like, you know, putting those into a machine and, you know, tossing them out. There are a lot of things that interpersonally affect us in our choice of religion and how we're doing that. And each is so individualized. Like for my situation, it was easier to stay a Christian, right? It would have been easier in a lot of aspects. But like for me, it was like, I don't care. Like if atheism is true, I will stand for it. But I have to know, like, why? In my own head, and like be able to, you know, think about that, you know, and be able to stand for it. And I feel glad that I wasn't able to. But you know, it's for other people, it's a different fight.
Yeah.
But like
I mean, yeah.
I think
Sorry,
I just think to be religious, there are a lot of reasons why it is inconvenient. Like personally, there were more probably social benefits, but there are a lot of things in the way that Christianity and faith dictates my life that make it more difficult. And you have to weigh, you have to calculate how those things are going into your decision when it comes to the actual choice of like where I put my allegiance and like what faith am I going to follow. They're serious questions.
Yeah. And I think it also leads to the, as you were saying, one thing, like for instance, in where I live at least, most people are atheists, I'd say, or at least not atheists, but very secular. That's the best way of putting it, like culturally secular, even the religious people. In that regards, compared to a country like even like America, is quite drastically different. Because America, many people are very religious still, and I mean that in the sense that they still do the practice, still go to church every day, every Sunday, not every day, every day. That'd be insane. I mean, every Sunday or something like that, and they'll still go to those different things. They all have communities around those stuff, and in this country, the people who go to church every Sunday, many of them, you would probably view them as a bit weird. And I don't mean that in a bad sense. I mean weird as in they're not normal, as in literally they are not the norm. And also the people who do that, I'm like, you think, oh, why do they need to go every day? Or every, I'm not, I keep saying, yeah, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Sorry, I mean, like it's more of a like clearly to me, it's like it's foreign. It's foreign. It is foreign in my thinking, and I don't mean foreign as bad. I just mean foreign as in it is not part of my culture. And again, religion is kind of culture. It's a culture effectively with certain metaphysical ideas. That's all it is.
Yeah.
It's not something separate from culture. It is part of it.
Well, it's interesting because throughout a lot of its history, Christianity has always sort of been this countercultural religion. But now it's become, especially in Western societies in America, it's the norm. It's the cultural standard. And though in a lot of ways, the way that that's adapted and manifested itself in culture starts making me feel like the odd man out, even being religious, because I don't quite fit into the boxes that I'm supposed to in that cultural norm. It's very interesting to kind of see, even when you are in the norm, there's still a lot of ways that you can be outside of that, even on paper, seeming to identify in a similar aspect. And I think probably a lot of the Christians who end up on bridges of meaning have similar feelings. We're all lost and we need a place to go. So we find our weird corner of the internet and, try to make it home.
Yeah. And again, it's an absolutely lovely discourse. So I love it. And I love all people on there discussions because you meet people of very different backgrounds, works, living some life, views on philosophy, religion, everything. And it's lovely to hear it because you wouldn't see that in normal life. Seriously. I could not have anything like that in my normal life because I don't know. One, I wouldn't know where to look. But it's not, even if I did know where to look, and I think I probably do have a bit of an inkling, you're not going to find the same thing. And that's because you're going to find a very select band of people. You're not going to find people from all over the world. And you really do have all over the world on this.
Yeah.
And I think that's half the thing. Like you got people getting from the States, Canada, you get the UK, you've got people in France, Netherlands, keep just going across. Then we've got people in the Middle East. We've got people in Southeast Asia. You've got people in Australia. You've got people. It is a big kind of swath of people. And yeah.
And it's so interesting because for a lot of us, we're trying to find the answers to the intellectual questions that we're all sort of like embedded in our minds, but through that we're also sharing certain experiences as well, where even if like they're obviously very different cultural experiences and personal experiences that go out, but we're seeing the connections through some of those things and creating like I think it just creates this bigger outlook on how it all operates. You can't be so like nation centric or like egocentric in a certain aspect. Like
I mean, sometimes nation centric is not necessarily a bad thing in that regards, because it is your own culture. You understand it, and actually it helps a lot more than just thinking about, okay, I'll have to learn someone else's culture and nation and their aspects and their customs and all that lot.
Yeah,
it's just a lot more difficult to get into.
Yeah.
But not just that, like one other thing I was thinking about is that some people are clearly talking about all the intellectual stuff, and really we're not really drawn here because of intellectual stuff. We're drawn here for other reasons. Yeah, we may have got here intellectual reasons, but we're not staying it for that reason. We're not drawn to it by that. We've got something else drawing us in. And it's kind of, you think you've got free will at times, but it's like, it only goes so far. And there's something else drawing you in. And whatever you want to call that, that's up to you. I'm not making any statements yet.
Well, listen, in the last couple of years, I've definitely started to question this whole idea of like, how much free will do I actually have?
I do believe in free will. There is free will, but that's not my concern. It's more like, for me recently, at least, things have just kind of happened, and things I've not planned just keep falling into place. And it's like, wait, what? I've not planned any of this. Why is it happening this way? And it's like, you can make, as the kind of joke goes, you tell God your plans and you'll make him laugh. But it is more of the things just kind of happen, and even your own thing you're kind of drawn to, you're on autopilot a lot of the time. And there's stuff you're unconscious effectively that's kind of driving a lot of it. And it's not that it's lack of free will, it's just your conscious is not aware of it.
Yeah,
your other urges going through.
Yeah, I can't say that I don't believe in free will, because there's still a big part of me that does. And like,
oh no, I fundamentally believe in free will, because I have to. I have no choice about it.
You have no choice, but I think there is part of me that,
I'm making a bad joke.
I think there is part of me that has started to kind of lose this false sense of like control. I'm a control freak. And so this idea, like you're saying, where things just seem to fall in place and fall in line, like there's been a lot of that in my life, and being pulled towards things and feeling like I'm not choosing my religion's choosing me. There's this like switch, and like, how do I
people don't choose ideas, ideas choose people kind of view. And there's a lot of things, like for me, like free will, I've kind of had to come to believe, no, free will is true. Like if you didn't have free will, there'd be no such thing as morality, therefore nihilism. That's pretty much my view.
Right.
And it's not a nice one to have, to be honest with you. But it's more like, okay, if that's the case, what does that hell that mean? And there's other questions. Because for me, not just, again, philosophy sounds like also intellectual, I'm just gonna say intellectual masturbation. It's not really just that. It's also what's the practicalness of it as well. Like how does it actually help in your daily life?
Yeah.
And sorry. And but it's more like, okay, and many of this actually really has helped me. I mean, seriously helped me.
Yeah.
And not just on a personal level, but helping for me, other people and all that stuff. And I think if you try and make it practical for yourself, it helps. And it really does. Because if you're just learning stuff and it has no use in the world, like what's the point?
Right. If you can't ground it in anything, like you have no place solid. You're like in La La fantasy land where you're just like creating other universes that don't even exist. It's like there's a part of you that has to eventually, land the plane, drop the anchor, get some practical, steps to move it forward.
Yeah. And it is weird, and a lot of it's helped me for me as well. And some things like views on morality and actually how to live a better life in that view, how to live the good life and stuff like that, how to think problems in your world and how to deal with those in that better way. Other things in general, there's some things as well, like how do you think about how because I've always been slightly interested, always been interested in how other people think and view the world, and clearly that's why it got me tracked this way, clearly. But if you I always try properly try and understand how people think, like why do they think that way, and what is the general idea, not just general, but general idea of those beliefs.
Yeah.
Because people don't just, a good example would be like communism. People say, oh, people are drawn to it because it's got free stuff. And I'm like, yes, but that's not why they think it. That's not the reason how they think it in their mind. And if you want to understand it, you truly have to put yourself in that situation and try and understand what's not just attractive to it, but what's kind of their philosophical underpinnings in their brain. And like, why is it, what is the next, if you were going to be that person, what would they think about this situation? What's the next idea about this thing? And it's really difficult.
Yeah, that's why people don't do it.
It's a good thought exercise to do, but it's why people don't do it. It hurts. It really is like it hurts your head to do it. And some people can't do it. They literally cannot, because if you're autistic, you cannot do this.
Well,
that means you've got a lack of theory of mind, and it's really hard to do.
I've had to stop putting on the atheist lens, because I can do that. I can put on the atheist nihilistic lens, and I've had to stop because the amount of mental gymnastics that I do and just the way that it puts me in a mental state is not a place I want to be. And so I very rarely will. Sometimes, like if I wanna test it again, I'll put it on. But like I've had to put it on the shelf and like take a break from it. It's quite
it's helpful to know. It is a mental game, like putting on, again, the atheist hat or the materialist hat is a better way of putting it, really. Or the reductivist physicalist hat, if you want to be even more technical. And it's like, okay, you put that hat on, you think that way, and if you really do take that view seriously, you don't go anywhere. You just don't. But even if you don't take it seriously, you do it in the way that most people think, you start realizing, well, there's a contradiction. That doesn't make any sense. That doesn't square with that thing. You're taking this thing out of nowhere. It's not self-evident, is it?
Yeah, you're living all of these delusions that you can't.
Yeah, it's quite delusional, and it's like you don't want to live there, because it's like, in some regards, people are walking contradictions. People hold thoughts, including myself. I have many of them. I know them. Like, this contradicts this thing. This thing is like this doesn't square with this thing. You can't put them together. It's like, of course you can. But then when you realize it, other people, it's like, damn.
Well, I think there's sometimes a difference between like dualities and then contradictions, and I think sometimes it takes that time to parse apart what are dualities and what are contradictions. Because and
like the dualities I know a bit well, again, from physics in general, but sometimes some things can be so they seem like completely different theories, but actually they're the same theory but describes it differently. But they can be in completely different fields, by the way. But that's called like duality in physics. Like a good example would be, actually I could just talk one thing I used to do on it. So for instance, they're called solitons. So solitons, the technical term, is a self-reinforcing wave packet. That means absolutely nothing to you, and I bet it doesn't. The best way of explaining it is, sometimes if you're on a canal, you can see these waves and you can walk alongside them and they will just never dissipate. And this, you can just walk on them for miles on end and you'll just see them go. These are what are called solitons. And these would be technically topological solitons, technical term. In like quantum mechanics, there's other things that pop up, and you can find these things, they behave a similar way. It's a completely different area of physics, completely different. But these are non-topological. They don't depend on the topology. Topology is like the shape of things, like how things kind of form. And you think, these are completely different things, but you find out actually they're described as either the same maths. And you go, wait, what? And another one in different, like quantum mechanics, sometimes you find these similar things and they start acting like particles, and they don't depend on the topology. Like, topology is the shapes of things, not necessarily the exact shape, like the general patterns. Like a ball is the same topology as shoe, effectively, which may sound bizarre. The thing is, you can shape a ball and like a Play-Doh and turn it into a shoe. In topology, it doesn't matter. That's the same kind of shape. Where a donut is a different thing. You can't shape that into a ball. You can't do the same translation. But a donut you could shape into a coffee mug because it's got one hole in it. But they're the same kind of, in topology, they're the same shape. But then in this quantum mechanics stuff, there's these non-topological ones that don't depend on the shape. And it turns out that you can actually find out there's actually a duality between these. You can describe them with the same mathematics, which is bizarre. You wouldn't think they are, because they're completely different areas of physics. There's many other dualities, like for instance, electromagnetism. So it used to be that they thought electricity and magnetism were different forces. Turns out they're actually the same, and they're just part of electromagnetism, and they're just two sides of the same coin. And it's like, oh, that's a weird thing, and they're just like different. But yeah, it's like you think they're contradictory, but they're not contradictory, or they're not different. They're actually the same thing. And sometimes you find, oh, this is weird. It is kind of beautiful, but it's also, huh?
Yeah. I feel like the world's full of those things.
Yeah.
And we try to explain them away, but we don't know how. We have no context.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's better just to embrace them.
Yeah. That's the best way of putting it. Yeah. And I think, again, for me, it's always been, I'm trying to understand other people has been very big, keeping me going. So in kind of sense, I've been interested in psychology in general, but it's not technically psychology in that regards. Because it's not understanding how the brain works or why people think that. It's more like people think, and they think differently. They view the world extremely differently from other people sometimes. And the question is, how do they think differently and why? And what does that mean as well? What does that mean to get to different conclusions? Because one of the things that I try to get into religion is in general is like, back in the past, people viewed the world very differently. And a good example of that would be if you again Genesis, the very beginning of Genesis.
Yeah.
It's saying that you got the earth below you, the heavens above, you got the firmaments, as said, the waters above, firmaments, and the waters below. And they're viewing it in a way, and it's kind of saying like, okay, the sun goes around you, the earth is flat, the sky looks like a dome. Well, it does.
Yeah.
And that's how people, but the thing is, that's how you actually perceive the world even now.
Right.
And that's, the scientific model is so abstract. I mean, it's not like, okay, the earth is going around this ball of gas and smoke, fire and smoke or whatever, like it's the sun. And then actually we're actually standing on this thing that's rotating on a ball, and it's like, okay, how am I imagining this? When I'm imagining I'm imagining if I'm actually above all of this and looking down. It's not how I experience the world.
Yeah.
Even though it says like, yeah, this is how it's like, that's not actually how the world works, nor how do you experience it.
Right.
It's a good model. But you could also model the sun going around the earth and it would just as work as well. Or you could model it as if the earth and the sun are actually going around another planet. It would work just as well.
Yeah. Well, that was something
all of those are technically not correct, but they're none of them are wrong at the same time. It's just, for us, when we day-to-day space, the earth is practically flat, unless you get really high up and then you start to see the curvature. But it's still flat, effectively, to you. So these ideas where it was more in touch about how you actually perceive the world, and from an evolution standpoint, if you go to scientific frame, is that we've evolved to feel that way, and that's clearly very successful because we're here. It's kind of, if it wasn't successful, we wouldn't be here. One of those stupid things. But then if you look at it from I'd say the religious standpoint, it's like, no, but it's actually kind of how the world works as well. Like, not just how we perceive it, but like it helps to describe things that go in that world. I'm using the world in so many different senses then.
Yeah.
I'm using like 5 different meanings of the word world. World, universe, phenomenological world, the mental world, it's just confusing. But yeah.
Well, the interesting...
Yeah, but I mean...
I think the interesting thing when you bring up like Genesis 1, the idea of what's the point of describing the universe there? Like, it's not meant to be the scientific like description of how the earth started. There's a bigger meaning underneath that. And it's like we put
not
all
just
of
that
these,
science didn't exist yet.
Right. We put all of these baggage from modern science and the way that we look at it. Like when we hear, the world, we see this little blue dot floating in space, but like they had no concept of that. And why are we putting that concept on a book that is not even trying to address that concept?
No, it's like, it doesn't make any sense. Like, even if you were going full on materialistic and said, actually, no, this is the correct way out, the way modern works, like, well, don't apply it to them because they didn't think that way. So it still doesn't work. So it's
well, I
no.
guess to play the devil's advocate, I think their issue would then be, if this is divinely inspired, wouldn't then they have gotten it right? Wouldn't have God have given them the correct?
But the question is, what do you mean by right? Because honestly, because the question is, if you're assuming it to be like a scientific literalist view of the world, good luck. I mean that in a bad. I mean, like, you're not going to go far, because it's not trying to describe that. It's, if you think about it, it's trying to describe the rest of the, how to read the rest of the books.
Well, and honestly,
everything.
it's working in conjunction with the other stories that are going around culturally. You know, like you read some of the Canaanite, or, you know, creation stories and these other things. It's in conversation with those things. So yeah, I think you're right in that. What's the purpose of it? Is it supposed to be this perfect science textbook? Then yeah, you have a problem. But that's not what it claimed to be, or is, you know, trying to be. You're putting that on that text, and that's not how you read literature.
No, like if you think of it, everything as, if you think of it in the scientific way, you're stripping out all the meaning of it. Literally, there's no meaning to it anymore. And that's what science does, is it cannot do with, there's no meaning in, well, I shouldn't say meaning, there's no purpose in science. There is no, effectively, no teleology is the best way of putting it. Things just happen, they just do. There's no goal that they're trying to achieve in that sense. It's not like an atom thinking, no, I know what I need to do. I mean to be right over there in a few minutes, so I've got to go this way and do. Well, maybe an atom thinks, I don't think it does, but it doesn't really work that way. Like, but for humans, we've got minds, we have reason, we have think of purpose, we have purposes, we act purposefully. These things is kind of a form of contradiction. Prove that you cannot act purposefully. Well, by doing so, you act purposefully. So yeah, it doesn't work. And it's kind of a case. We have this concept of purpose, which you cannot test scientifically. And it's like, you can't. But the thing is, with science, you need this concept of idea of purpose and reason to even do science in the first place. It's like, if you put science as first, you're ignoring all the rest.
Yeah.
And again, if you're just applying that something like an old way of thinking the world, like this Genesis, which again is, it seems to be interesting, is that it's not just in like the Abrahamic religions. This worldview does apply to other ones. Like the other ones would go, yeah, I understand that one. It may be some minor tweaks here and there, but they understand it.
Yeah.
Which is really interesting to me. Like, why are they understanding it? How is it that cultures which have been so separated for thousands upon years could understand both of them? Is it like there's an innate way of looking at the world, and like obviously that's obvious, or is it more like there's something more deeper there? Like, I don't know which one it is. It could be both, clearly, and probably is both. But I don't know.
Another mystery to probably be solved another day.
If it is to be solved, who knows?
Yeah.
Where's the fun in that?
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for sitting and talking with me, Bill.
No problem.
I enjoyed this.
Pleasure.
Yeah, I enjoyed this so much.
Thank you so much for listening. As always, I will close with the Serenity Prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.